We are working our way, as I don't know why I keep telling you all this, it's not like you've forgotten. I can't imagine you would have forgotten by now that we're working our way through the 10 Commandments. We are now on the commandment that says, do not steal. And we've been looking at some of the old law regarding theft and defining theft. And in particular, I think what is particularly relevant for us, or maybe relevant is a little too strong a word, what's interesting for us living in the society that we do is the fact that God's law does have quite a lot of thought put into it about how to deal with not just somebody taking something, but when somebody gets the benefit of a transfer of value to them, even if it's not necessarily intentional, even if it's something where they borrowed something and then it gets destroyed or whatever, God's law has provisions for that, which is an interesting thing because that's a relatively advanced concept compared to the simple idea of do not steal. And so it speaks to the fact, I think, that the person responsible for this law is not just a man kind of making stuff up, but rather God himself thinking through kind of some of the big picture stuff that maybe you don't think of until eventually you figure this stuff out because you don't have a law about it, and then something happens and suddenly you go, we should have a law about that. That's, I mean, if you understand how our legal system developed, that's what the common law system literally is you start off with a certain number of laws and then you add more and you interpret them through the lens of experience and then you're good to go. Yes, sir?
It also speaks to the fact that the person in the face of God dreamt all this, I dreamt up, that's bad. We planned all this out and had it written down, knows us pretty well.
Yes. Yes, indeed. And so unlike most laws where you have to keep adding stuff to it as things go wrong and you say, oh, we didn't think of that. This law has a bunch of stuff in it that you wouldn't really likely have thought of if you were just making up laws for yourself. Now, the counterpoint to that, and it's not something we should ignore, is that unlike most of the Israelites, Moses had the advantage of growing up in the court of Pharaoh in what was at the time the most advanced society in the world with a fairly comprehensive legal system. So more than most Israelites, he would have understood the implications of a lot of these laws that he was talking about to an extent that they probably would not have, and maybe in many cases didn't really understand until we get around to the Pharisees and some of those groups that specialized in the law in the latter part of the pre-first century. So in any event, though, we have some pretty advanced thinking here. And I think the most interesting, and this is the one that I think most speaks to what you just said, Ken, is this part at the end there. We looked at this briefly last week, and I just wanted to pick up here for a second. Is this part at the end where it talks about what happens if you admit it. Before anybody catches you, before anybody can prove it, before anybody maybe even suspects you, what happens if you admit it? And so in Leviticus chapter 6, said if anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving a neighbor about something entrusted to them or left in their care or about something stolen, or if they cheat their neighbor, or if they find lost property and lie about it, or if they swear falsely about such a sin that people may commit, when they sin in any of these ways and realize their guilt, they must return what they have stolen or taken by extortion, what was entrusted to them, or lost property they found, or whatever it was they swore falsely about. They must make restitution in full, add a fifth of the value to it, and give it all to the owner on the day they present their guilt offering. So we see in here that there is still a consequence. Not only do you have to give it back, but you have to give 1/5 of the value. You also have to present a guilt offering for having committed the sin that you committed. But the difference between that and the other versions that we were looking at earlier, where it was paying back multiple times what the thing was worth, or a variety of really, really high levels of restitution, a 1/5 addition is a pretty small amount. And it's interesting because I think there's two aspects to this. First of all, there's the aspect of recognizing the person who actually does feel guilty and does the right thing. And I think by and large, and those of you who are parents, which may be pretty much everybody in here, unless I'm mistaken, having been a child and knowing how my parents acted, it is generally more noble and more preferred as a parent to have your child admit to you when they did something wrong than it is to have them continue to cover it up. And in general, that leads to a lesser punishment. My brother got in a lot of trouble growing up because he would never admit what he did. And it was a constant struggle to get him to admit those things. I got in a lot less trouble than him because I always felt so bad I would just tell them about it, and it didn't work very well. So, it worked well for me, I suppose. But so the first aspect of it is that we attribute value to someone who feels bad about something and admits it without having to be caught. And we see very rarely that that happens in our modern society, at least when it comes to public figures. Public figures almost always hide it and hide it and hide it and hide it until the last, it's going to come out or it's already come out, and then they want to apologize and tell us how sorry they are, what a terrible mistake it was. And of course we all believe them because they're all such honest people. And maybe not. So the one side of it is we want to honor and we want to reward that kind of behavior. And that flips around the other side, which is we also want to incentivize that behavior. And so there's a degree to which this is an incentivization to someone whose conscience is bothering them. And God, I think, would hope and maybe even assume that the Israelites would be the sort of people whose conscience would bother them if they did something wrong. And so he's trying to incentivize them to do the right thing when that happens by reducing the consequences of what they would otherwise face. So I think there's an understanding of human nature here on two levels. First of all, there's an understanding that it is difficult for us to admit when we did something wrong. And so we want to reward that or uphold that. And secondly, there's a recognition that when you give people a reason to do the right thing, they're more likely to do the right thing. And so God provides both of those in here by this approach. Any comments or questions, thoughts about that? There is the penalty offering here, the ram from the flock. I mentioned this last week. This is kind of interesting because this means that if you stole something of lesser value than a ram, you're a real idiot because you're going to have to pay a ram back on top of whatever you give back. And you need to do better math, I guess is maybe the way to say it. So, Jerry?
I was just carrying this to maybe to the next step would be God's recognition that he appreciates maybe more if we recognize the sins that we commit before somebody else tells us, or before, that we our conscience bothers us with sin, not just stealing, but sin.
Right.
And that might be a part of what he's telling us as well.
I would agree with that. And in fact, when I was talking earlier, I meant to be even more general than I was. Especially when we talk about public figures, rarely is that they've stolen something, although that's occasionally the case. It's usually something else that they've done. And for most of us, it's the same way. Stealing is not as, there are little kinds of theft. Some of the ways that we define theft, like finding lost property and not returning it, there are a lot of people who would probably do that. But in our society today, I would say that the majority of people, I could have been able to say the vast majority 20 years ago, but the majority of people don't steal. They don't need to, and they don't usually choose to, at least not in terms of what they think about stealing. Now, we do have people who kind of forget that, taking stuff from the office is stealing and, and some things like that. But in general, stealing is not a rampant problem that we have among the average member of society. It's more of a problem in certain locations, and it's more of a problem with certain kinds of financial situations and stuff like that. But it's not as common as it might have been in the kind of society that we would have encountered in the first century, or the desire at least, because of how abject their poverty was in a lot of cases. But nevertheless, when we see, when David, for example, talks about his sin with Bathsheba in the Psalms, he talks about how he felt a weight pressing on him, that it was almost like he was under a cloud of death because of the sin, and it wasn't until he confessed it that it got it, lifted the weight. Now, obviously, in his case, he'd been called out before he confessed it. But I think that God wants our consciences to recognize when we've done something wrong, wants us to feel compelled by them to make it right, and would much rather have it done that way than where we have to be confronted with it and sort of forced to deal with it the way that we so often see happening in our society, and historically that's just been true with humans in general. So yeah, I absolutely think God prefers it that way and incentivizes us to do it that way. So yeah. Okay, so let's move from the Old Testament, or at least from the Old Testament, into a little bit towards the end of the Old Testament, and then into some New Testament ideas about this. And before we transition to the New Testament, I want to take a look at Malachi, because Malachi is really speaking here in a way that's outside of just what the law is. And I think to the principle that we think of when it comes to robbing God, stealing from God. So Malachi says, speaking on God's behalf, will a man rob God? Yeah, and of course, you think, well, how can I possibly rob God? God is spirit. He doesn't have things. He doesn't own things. He said, actually flat out says, I don't need anything. How can you rob God? And he says, but you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, so that there may be food in my house, and test me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the window of heaven and pour out for you a blessing until it overflows. So there's a principle here, I think, that we need to understand, and we also need to understand the limitations of that principle as well. So when we talk about the principle, first of all, what is the basic principle that we see here in this passage? I think there's maybe a couple of them.
God talks about food in his house, and not for widows, orphans, whoever needs it. The prosperity preachers preach now that we're of God because we're not giving them money. But he doesn't talk about money.
Okay.
He talks about provision.
Okay. Well, you're getting a little ahead of me, but you're not wrong about you're not wrong about any of it. But the first thing you said was that he talks about bringing food into the house to make provision. Now, first and foremost, who was the food for that was brought into the house of the Lord?
Levites, priests, all the...
Okay. So the Levites and the priests first and foremost. And in fact, the way it was set up was that the Israelites are supposed to provide 10% of their produce to the Levites, who would then provide the best 10% of that to the priests. So there was a process by which this was done. And so when God says you're robbing me, in a very real way, what he's saying is you're robbing me by robbing the people who are the ones who need this system. Because the priests and the Levites did not own a significant amount of land. They had the cities of refuge, and that was about it. And so they didn't have big flocks and herds. They didn't have a way to generate material wealth because their job was to work before the Lord, and their wealth was the service that they provided. So in theory, at least, a priest and Levite should never really become wealthy in and of themselves because they were depending on God. But if you're depending on God and the system that God has set up for dependence is the people are going to bring in the stuff you need, and the people won't bring that stuff in, then you are robbing God's workers, basically. And in that way, you are indeed robbing God, because it either means they're going to starve, or they're going to have to go find some other work, and it's going to take away from their ability to work for God. So the first thing we have to understand is that we can rob God when there's an expectation by God that we are to give something, that we are to provide something. Whether that expectation is a command that he's given us, or whether that expectation is, as Ananias and Sapphira found out, when you say you're doing something, either way, once that expectation exists, then we are expected to follow through on it. So this is the first thing we understand, is the principle that it is possible to rob God, not because God needs stuff, but because if there's a relationship there that has an expectation of us giving something, not doing that is failing. And we can expand it, I'll give you a second. We can expand that beyond just the issue of giving money. And we can expand that to things like our time and our service and a lot of those things that God asks from us as well, that a lot of times we fall short on. In fact, I would argue that in our society it's pretty easy, for a lot of us at least, to give 10% of our income to God. Especially if you've been budgeting for it and doing that your whole life, it's kind of built in. And so that isn't necessarily terribly challenging in our society. But when God says, I need 20 hours from you this week, and you say, well, okay, but see, the thing is, I've got a job, and I've got kids, and I like to sleep sometimes, and also I was going to go fishing, and I could give you maybe 4. Would that be close? You know, and so it's we're in that place where the things that God wants from us isn't just money. In fact, it isn't primarily even money. And so we can rob God when we won't provide him what our relationship expects of us. Okay?
And I think the second principle we see, and I don't want to sound like a prosperity preacher, but to some extent, God's blessings in our lives are tied to our following that first principle of giving. And it's been said you can't outgive God, and God has promised if we return to him whatever we, and I'm going to Testament on you, but in their case, the 10%, they couldn't not succeed because God would provide for them so that they can provide for others.
Yes. We have to be careful with that principle
Yes.
today because of the prosperity theology thing. But before we get into the prosperity, let's talk about the transition here, because we've clearly transitioned from bringing, animals and produce from our fields into church and, setting it down and here you go, minister, your dinner awaits, to using money. We do money in our contributions, and by the same token, we're not the first group to do that. That goes all the way back to, we see it in the first century, where a lot of the contribution that was being made was people putting money into boxes in front of the temple. And one of Jesus's, not parables, one of his comments, of course, is on seeing that situation where a bunch of wealthy people are putting in lots of bags of coins and everything else, and the poor widow comes up and puts in a couple of coins that are worth basically what we would think of as a penny today. And Jesus's point is that she gave more because she gave out of her need. But even if we, setting aside the specific point of that parable, there's a transition that happens between when this is written in Exodus and when the law is written about how the tithe works, and what we see even here in Malachi. I'm pointing to what I can read, or the ones up there for you guys, what we see in Malachi, and to what we see in the first century, to where a lot of the contribution is in the form of money. What has changed? Why are people bringing money instead? Because the original law actually disapproved of money. Now, if you couldn't bring all of your tithe with you, what it said is sell it, and then when you get close to the temple or where the tabernacle is, buy it again so you can bring the stuff with you. It really never contemplated you bringing a bunch of money and giving it. So what has changed between the time of Moses and even the time of Malachi and the time of the first century?
I was thinking the answer to that is Romans 12:1, the living sacrifice.
Okay, but we're talking about the Jews right now.
Okay.
Yeah, don't get ahead of me yet. We're going to get there, but not yet.
They're transitioning right now from their herds and all that, and they're starting to be more in cities, that kind of stuff, where they don't have the herds and all these shepherd type jobs. Now they're doing other things, and that's what's happening here.
Yeah. Okay, that's exactly right. Mark has hit it for us on the head. So when the idea when the Israelites went into Israel, into Canaan, was that they would be given individually, they'd all be given land. And they were. If you go through, I wouldn't see. I mean, if you're reading through, by now you've probably hit Joshua. Joshua, the book of Joshua, and you've discovered that about half of the book of Joshua is some really interesting stories, and the other half of the book of Joshua is like going down to the county recorder's office and going through the deeds. It's not the funnest and most enlightening read that you can have. But what you see in there is a very detailed description of how they broke the land up by tribe, by clan, and so everybody got some land. Everybody had some land, or their family had some land. And so they would work that land, and they would, whether it was farming or whether it was herding or it was a mix of the two, they were an agrarian people, and the way that the system was set up was to give them agrarian places to live and work and defend. And so the concept was about the land, growing things and growing animals. You fast forward to the first century, and that system has broken down for a number of reasons. The first one is they were taken into captivity, and when they were returned to a much smaller area than they'd had before, and in much smaller numbers than they'd had before, and they had to contend with people who moved into the places that they lived and kind of taken them over. And so they don't have access to the kind of land they had before. They've also lost, it appears, most of the records of who owned what. And so the way that people got land had more to do with how politically connected they were or how wealthy they were when they moved back into the land than it did with who actually should have owned the land because of what had been allotted to who. So for the most part, what you don't have anymore is a nation of sort of equally ranked farmers and herdsmen who can all look at their neighbor and say, he and I both have about the same. Maybe he does better than I do because he works harder or because he's got better ideas, but we all got the same land. We all started off in kind of the same place. What you now have is a nation that has a small number of people who have and a lot of people who don't have. And the people who don't have end up doing one of two things. They end up going to work for the ones who have. Hence Jesus' description, for example, of the workers who work in the vineyard and get paid, and they come in at different times, but they all get paid a talent, a day's wage at the end of it. And so a lot of people worked in the field or worked raising herds or whatever, but they didn't own them. And so at the end of their work, they didn't have an animal, they had money that they'd been paid for. And by the same token, the others that didn't do that would oftentimes find some other kind of business. So because you now have cities, as Mark said, you have people who travel long distances, especially places like Jerusalem. Now you have innkeepers, and you have bankers, and you have shopkeepers, and you have a lot of things that would have been kind of a secondary source of income. If you read the parable, or not the parable, the Psalm proverb about the woman of good character, she actually like runs a side business basically. So those things existed way back then, but by this time they become people's primary means of surviving. But all of these things generate money and not animals. And so produce. And so now you have an interesting situation, because technically, if you don't have any produce or any animals, are you obligated to tithe under the law of Moses?
Nope.
No, you're not. Now that seems sort of odd to us, but the law of Moses explicitly says, here's how you determine your tithe. And it's kind of like if the IRS just forgot one major source of income for everybody, and didn't assess that. Well, okay, if I don't pay that, I'm not breaking any laws, I'm not doing anything wrong. In fact, one of the big challenges the IRS has right now is people who have a lot of money will put it into investments where it generates more and more and more money, but until they pull it out, the IRS historically has not recognized that as profit, and it makes it really hard to tax that money. And there's a lot of money tied up like that right now. A huge amount of the money in our society is tied up in that kind of investment, because those people are investing it, looking, and there are opportunities to pull parts of it out without having to pay tax or paying a lower tax rate, so they just leave it in there for as long as they can, as long as they don't need to live on it. I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying that's the system. Well, that is a source of income, a way where money is being generated that you don't have to pay taxes on. And if you did pay taxes on them, you'd be an idiot, because you're paying taxes on something you don't have to. So, on the one hand, the law does not obligate someone to pay tithe on the money they've been given. And so actually, when you look in Ezra and Nehemiah, where they're dealing with this reality to some extent, they talk about them giving free will offerings, where you are choosing to go and to give some of your money. But there's no obligation, there's no specific percentage, there's nothing like that. Which I think is really interesting, because you think about the application of that principle to our modern principle, and you can see where the idea of the 10% really falls apart from the Old Testament to the New Testament in terms of the time periods. And by the same extension, if it fell apart just even when the old law was in place, it certainly is no longer specifically applicable to us to say that we have to tithe 10% of stuff. Of our money or whatever, and particularly to a preacher who is preaching this prosperity theology, which we'll get to in just a second here. But go ahead.
As a counterpoint to that, there were different times in the Old Testament. I think specifically under the time of Hezekiah, one of the great times of rebuilding the temple, where there were these monetary offerings that were collected for specific purposes.
Right.
So that was above and beyond the tithe. Right.
Exactly. So the idea under Hezekiah, and the idea that Ezra and Nehemiah basically carried forward, was that same basic idea, which is there is a need. And there is a need that exists because of the fact that we aren't that kind of economy anymore. And so the temple needs to be, upkept. There are things that need to be bought. There are things that money can do now that labor could have done in the past. So we need money. And so they're calling for free will offerings, whether it was under Hezekiah, I think Josiah did it. In fact, Josiah is the one who probably get the most clear description of how they went through, because it kind of looks like maybe the priests were just kind of dipping their hands into the money. And so Josiah is the one who locks the boxes shut and drills holes in them so you can actually put the stuff in, and then will only allow them to be opened when he's got a representative there along with the priest representative to make sure that everything's getting done on the up and up. But in any event, there's a recognition, even during the history of the Old Testament, of this gradual transition. But the actual law doesn't really specifically address it, except in terms of authorizing or commanding to a certain extent free will offerings. But ultimately, a free will offering is much more of an expression of faith than a tithe is, because a tithe is complying with the requirements. And I think when we look at this passage here, what God is saying is, you're not tithing. You're not giving me what you know you're supposed to give me. But we can extend that principle to giving more broadly, which is, if God has called on us, as he has as Christians, as Jerry said, to live a life that is a living sacrifice, then we are not giving to God when we don't do that. If you can't see from looking at someone's life how they are living as a sacrifice to God, it's probably somewhere along the line that the ball has been dropped, and that this concept has been lost. And I think when we extend this into the New Testament concept, we also have to extend and understand this idea of opening up the blessings of heaven and how that applies to us. Because with the Israelites, they lived and they operated in a physical system. Now there was faith, there was love, there were spiritual principles, don't misunderstand me. But the law was mostly about governing the physical. You know, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. At the beginning of that, love the Lord your, you should love the Lord your God, and and no idolatry and stuff like that. But ultimately, much of the law is about physical. You know, if there's a spot on your tent, you got to burn it, whatever it is, or cut it off, or whatever. There's a bunch of stuff like that, and the tithe is very much a physical thing as well, rooted in the physicality of what you've grown and what you've raised, and bringing those and sharing them. But or I should say, and thus the Israelites had been conditioned to think that the blessings that came would be of a physical nature. And when you read the Old Testament, especially the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy, that's absolutely what God is promising. The blessings, two kinds of blessings. One is, I'm going to be your God, and you're going to be my people. So there's a spiritual blessing that goes way beyond what all the other people of the world have. But number two, I'm going to bless you physically. I'm going to give you a good land. I'm going to give you success against your enemies. Your crops are going to grow. All the things that people pray to gods for and do all sorts of worship for, I'm going to give that to you if you do what I tell you to, and Malachi, and if you follow this expectation as well. Because by the time of Malachi, we're talking about a period of time that's well after the Israelites have returned from captivity. We are well along the progression towards the more modern version of Judaism that we see in the first century. You're at that inflection point where you have had some very bad leaders doing some very bad things and misleading the people. And Malachi talks about that. And you're at the beginning of, or within a few decades of, the Pharisaical revolution, where they are going to push back against that and try to bring in a very much an active form of faith and following of the law. So this is going to happen, but right now you're kind of in that inflection point. So the Israelites were turning back towards God, and he is identifying in Malachi some of the specific places that they've fallen short and need to continue. So I have had Ken for a while, and I've got Steve, so go ahead, Ken.
If you're going to cover this, I won't go there, but the deformed sacrifices?
I was not specifically.
Okay, isn't that also in Malachi?
Yes, I believe it is, where you're bringing stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
To bring the tithe, if you will, but they bring animals that are substandard for what God requires. And I love that question God asked him, would you take this to your governor? How do you think he would react?
Right.
You know, am I any less than that? So that's another way of robbing God.
When you're giving him a lesser version. Yeah. And I think that we can apply that obviously to the spiritual side as well. You know, when we always used to kind of joke about, parents who, they would focus on quality versus quantity, But I can't spend very much time with my kid, but I'll 1 hour a week and it's going to be really good. And the truth is that it doesn't work like that, There is a need for quality and quantity for doing it well and not simply just doing it enough or something like that. So, Steve.
And I may be getting ahead, but to me the concept of Old Testament tithing, and some people in today's modern times consider their giving as a tithe, but I see a difference, because tithing is a little bit like paying the IRS what they're owed. So you pay it and the rest is yours. You get to do with it what you want, spend it any way you want, do with it what you want. So it was an obligation back then. So once you paid your tithe, but we're done. Where the concept today is, we've been purchased with a price where, there's no more tithing. We're 100% into it.
Right.
The concept is that we don't own anything anymore. It's all God's.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where the principle, on the one hand, there's a validity to this where it says, test me if I want, open the windows of heaven, pour out for you blessing until it overflows. Jesus told his followers, that anybody who gives up homes and families and lands and properties is going to be rewarded with those things and vastly more in the time to come. And yet Jesus also told his followers, if you follow me, you're going to be poor. And specifically to the ones who were with him on earth. I'm talking about the apostles and some of those disciples. And he lived a life of, maybe poverty isn't quite the right word, but he lived a life that was highly dependent on others to care for him. He did not seek jobs, he did not seek wealth. And he told his followers not to focus on wealth. In fact, he says, he teaches more on the dangers of wealth than almost anything else. If you go through there and read his teachings, he talks a lot about how dangerous and problematic wealth is. He never says, don't be wealthy, or don't have a good job, or anything like that. What he says is, be careful because it gets in the way of a relationship with God. And so it seems like when we look at this principle here, we need to be keeping in mind that just as we have transitioned from a physical focused worship and form in the old law to a spiritual focused form in Christianity, and just as we transition from thinking we've got to give 10% of everything we have because that's part of our obligation, to the understanding that everything we have and everything we are belongs to God, we also should recognize that this kind of blessings is not simply about getting more and more and more stuff if we give more and more and more money, which is what the prosperity theologists would like to teach. And of course, the system works from their perspective because they're the ones that are getting the result of all of that more and more and more money that's coming in. But rarely does the system work from the perspective of the believers, because Christianity is not a bargain. Christianity is not some sort of a deal you've struck with God. Christianity is a response to the grace of God that's transformative, not negotiative. And so, I think that's not a word, but I just made one up. It sounds really nice, negotiative, right? So Christianity is not about how much am I going to get back if I give you this much. What about if I give you this much? You know, it doesn't work like that. And so the danger of prosperity theology, there's two dangers. Number one, I think it's simply a false teaching in the sense of it's not biblically founded. But number two, it gets you focused too much on the material side of things. What am I going to get? And you end up living in that place instead of living in the spiritual place that God wants us to be. Sylvia.
And in the New, it just says God wants a cheerful giver, not grudgingly. But he also warned where you give. The good ground, the good steward. You know, God knew what's going on in our world today. If you give to a church or an organization who has a false gospel, you actually help them to spread a false gospel. So you need to be aware what you do with what God has given you.
That is a really good point, and one that I had not thought to make. We do have to be very mindful that what we do with our money and our blessings can undermine the cause of Christ if we choose poorly. Now, I don't fault us for the fact that sometimes we get fooled and sometimes people take advantage of us. That happens, and there's no, the sin is on their part when we're trying to do what's right and it's taken advantage of. But there are other times where people simply don't make any effort to determine whether what they're doing is really beneficial or a good thing. They don't really pay any attention to what's being taught or what's being said. And I have always been very leery to put my name and reputation on the line for what somebody else is teaching and what somebody else is doing unless I'm very confident in who they are and in what they're teaching about. Because I don't want to lend whatever shred of credibility I might have, that people might listen to me. I don't want to lend that to something that ultimately is harmful. And again, sometimes we miss it even though we try and people take advantage of us. But by and large, we need to be discerning in how we give and what we give for. And I think, we certainly see there's more and more tools that are available to us today to hold people accountable, organizations, individuals to whom we give money, to make sure that it's being used for the right purposes, and we ought to avail ourselves of those. There's nothing wrong with saying, I'd like to know what you're doing with this, or I'd like to know where this is going, and getting the reports and seeing the evidence of that. Jerry is extremely scrupulous about making sure that we know what our money's being spent for, that's been contributed here at the church, and how our finances are and stuff like that. And I think that's admirable. And that's very much different from, and I know it's gonna sound like I really have a problem with these guys, because I do, but the prosperity theologists, the money just disappears. There's no accountability. They fight actively to make sure that the government can't look at the things, their receipts and their assets and things like that, and they use freedom of religion as a cover for that. And I don't think that if you're a religion, you should ever be afraid of saying, here's how much money we took in, here's what we did with it. Because you think that you're going to have a problem if you're accountable to the IRS. Who are you really going to have a problem with when you have to be accountable? You know, exactly. And the sanctions that he can impose are so far beyond what the IRS is allowed to do that it's worth remembering that. And so if you won't be accountable to the government or the public, then you certainly probably have something you don't want God to know about. You know, so I think that there is reasonably an expectation of accountability, and that we should be able to ask those questions.
My dad he was treasurer when I was growing up, and he would always say that if you didn't do it right, you'd get struck with lightning.
There you go. Well, you never know. It would be interesting to come into church one day and find the treasurer like struck by lightning.
Yeah.
Well, now we know what he was doing with money. So, Karen?
Do I need to move?
Talk about Jerry being screwed, just absolutely on target. Back when Steve and I had a little gift shop down on Main Street, and I had something to do, and Jerry offered to watch it that day. And when I got done with what I was doing, I'd been to the business showcase, I was exhausted, and I came back, we were closing down, and Jerry was off a quarter. And he worked, I offered to give him a quarter, but he wouldn't take it until he got that right.
Figured out where the quarter had gone. Yes, I get it.
So he is exactly.
And you know, and we all know people, and hopefully we all are people like that, but we all know people where we know that if we put something into their responsibility, that they're like Joseph, that they're going to make sure it gets done right, that things are going to come out well, and if something goes wrong, they're going to feel worse about it than we ever would. I can remember a couple of years ago, maybe more than that now, I loaned my dad one of my handguns to practice with and try it out, see if it was something he might like to have something like that. And he had it for, I don't know, 6 or 8 months. It was one that I wasn't using very often at all anymore. And after he gave it back to me, eventually he just didn't feel like it was the right gun for him or the right type of gun. But he gave it back to me and he said, I did my best to clean it, but I don't know if I did well enough. And I said, Dad, you're one of the few people, when you give me the gun back, it'll be cleaner than I've ever had it before. So I'm not worried about that at all. But that's the kind of people we should be, and that's certainly the kind of people that our organizations should be, because we are handling God's money. You know, when people give us money as a church, when people give us time or effort, we are using that on behalf of God as the priests who serve in His house, because we are that too. And so we absolutely have an obligation to honor that gift and use it responsibly.
I was going to say, working in the bank, you have to balance to the penny every night. And it's always, I mean, you know, the worst thing you can do is have somebody find a penny or something out in the lobby and give it to you. It's like, no, really, you don't really want that penny, because you know.
Only going to cause problems.
Yeah, it's going to cause problems. You've got to find some account to put that money, that penny in, you know, a miscellaneous type of thing, because you sure can't put it in your drawer, because it's going to cause you to be a penny over. And banks don't look at it as, you know, oh, well, she balances most of the time except for this penny. You balance or you don't.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you're $10 off or whether you're $100 off or, you know, whatever. I mean, I did see it once where a person was $1,000 off, and it was right before she had, I mean, it was right after she had given her notice. They didn't let her touch money the rest of the time she was there.
Yeah.
But most of the time, you know,
It's
you
little
can't
bits.
find those little things, you know.
Yeah.
You can be fired for not balancing on a consistent basis, and, you know, so you don't want any extra there. You want to balance to the penny every night.
Because anytime you're over or under, it either means, if it's a bank, it either means you've given some of the bank's money away, or you have taken somebody else's money that didn't know they gave it to you.
Right.
You know, or you haven't accounted for what they've given you. However it is.
You've shorted them.
Exactly. So somebody has lost out in that transaction.
Yeah.
And we think of our lives in those terms, not in the sense of being paranoid that we're going to get balance at the end of every day, But in the sense of being responsible with what we've been given, the time that we've been given, the effort that we've been given, the health, the money, whatever it is, if we think in terms of being responsible with that, and that we are going to give an accounting, not to a banker who's going to fire us or a God who's angry, but nevertheless to a God who did give that to us and expects us to do something proper with it.
Well, I don't know where it is, but there's a scripture, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting.
That's true, yeah.
I think that's in the Old Testament.
I believe so, yes. And so that idea of giving an accounting is more about making sure that we're using what we've been given properly. Linda?
It's interesting, when we had our school, we had a direct contract with the California Department of Education. And when it came to accounting, they had what they called covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Mm-hmm. And that's what this is all reminding me of. And then we had an independent audit every year to make sure that we did follow that, by the way. I mean, so we are still doing that today in different ways. We're just looking at it differently. We're not really comparing and contrasting.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think for us as Christians, the critical thing is to be able to transition this from the money thing to the broader picture. And that's where we struggle the most, because like I said, as Americans, most of us have been pretty financially blessed. Certainly if you compare it to the rest of the world, if you compare it to most of history, we have been very blessed. America, I'm just talking about this with my students right now, America after World War II had an economic explosion that has never been replicated before or since in the history of the world. If there was a period of time for about 10 years after the end of World War II, that our nation by itself was producing 50% of all the industrial output in the entire world. And when you consider that our population was significantly less than 10% of the world's population, you understand just what that means financially. It means that half of the world's money is flowing into this country where 8% of the world's people live. And so we became insanely wealthy as a country. Now, that doesn't mean we have people like, the single individual wealthiest. Well, we do have some of those too now, but it wasn't so much that one person became super, super wealthy, as much as it was that almost everybody became wealthy in ways that people throughout history couldn't even dream of. And for the most part, we have sustained that. Now, there have been some hiccups and some stumbles, and we've lost some of, certainly that production relative to the rest of the world was no longer true. But the simple fact is that we are still running on the benefits that were started back there in the 1940s and 1950s. And as a country, we are incredibly blessed. And that, ironically, makes it relatively easy for us to do things with money that we don't want to do with our time or with our effort. But sometimes those are the things that God wants. And I mean, all the time that's what God wants, but sometimes those are the things that God needs. And so we need to be smart enough to recognize that it's not just the money, that it's a lot of this other stuff, and not get distracted by people who are focusing exclusively on the money because it benefits them. And so we need to be a little wiser. All right, we're going to stop now because it is time to stop now, and people are starting to come in and wonder why I'm still up here. So let's take a break, and we'll come back at 10:30.